All right, welcome back. RealFootballAnalysis.com. We're going to talk about our preseason preview. All our analysis is in from the off season and training camp. We're in the preseason mode now. We do quite a bit of analysis during training camp to cover all of the off season changes and moves, and we'll go into this is going to be our preview number 2. And what we're trying to build up is for our next podcast being the true um, preview that talks about what we want to end up in that is potential Super Bowl matchups. But before we rush to judgment um, and look at potential Super Bowl teams and teams that are on the upswing, we want to look at the details of what teams are in the upswing and why, because it's different from what you're going to hear on ESPN and some of the traditional media outlets. Remember, last year at this time, we were talking about how Carolina had no weapons, they had no shot at really being a contender because all they had was Cam Newton, a good defense, and that's it. No Kelvin Benjamin because he went down during training camp and preseason. And, who's going to be their weapons? Who's going to catch the ball? Well, that didn't turn out to be an issue when you're blocking and tackling so well, which is where our analysis comes in. And they did plenty of passing as well, plenty of receivers. Can make a name for themselves when the rest of the team is playing what we call the ultimate team sport very well. And so Ted Ginn made a name for himself in that scheme. So now we're going to build up to that podcast, which will be coming in about a week. And we're on our preview number 2. Now, in the first preview, we bounced between both conferences, AFC and NFC, while reviewing the NFC East. While reviewing the NFC and AFC East and South from both conferences. I'm sorry, NFC East and North. So in this podcast, we're going to talk about the NFC and AFC South and West. So let's start with the NFC South, okay? In the South, it's kind of wide open after the Panthers. And let me also just say that in the last podcast, when I used the word flux, what we're looking at and what we're talking about in terms of flux is a lot of free agent and draft, a lot of personnel departure and arrival. That seems to happen a lot when you have a new first-year head coach. Okay, so we're looking at stability. We're kind of looking at that Steelers formula that now has worked for the Bengals, which is solid owner, solid front office, and the same coach for as many years as possible. That stability actually seems to shorten rebuilding time. And the Steelers have been rebuilding. But look, they were a contender last year while still rebuilding their defense just because their offense had kind of finally come around and rebuilt after 2 or 3 seasons. And yet they win in those seasons anyway, even if they don't make the playoffs, which is a rarity for the Steelers. So we believe that stability comes all the way from the top down to the head coach, which how many head coaches have they had? The Steelers have had only, well, you can count them on in one hand. So the Bengals, who used to hire and fire coaches like the Raiders do, have now, Raiders and Browns, I should say, have now just stuck with Marvin Lewis. So Carson Palmer left. So Chad Ochocinco left. They didn't go with all that fanfare, and even in those years, people were saying, "Oh, the Bengals don't have a quarterback, they don't have a receiver." Well, Ochocinco didn't even make it that big a splash in New England, and that was kind of the end of his career. It was good that they stuck with their head coach. So enough about that stability in the NFC North. We talked about that on the last podcast. Let's go and look at the South and the West in both conferences and keep in mind what I meant about flux and stability. Now, the Panthers, the Carolina Panthers, are different from all the other teams in the South for the most part because they do have a lot of stability, and coming off a Super Bowl victory, you would expect that. They did lose, you know, a couple of people on the offensive line that just provide the depth. Just some of your older, 1-year contract veteran types like Fernando Velasco, who filled in for at center and provided depth. He went. He's off to Buffalo. We'll see how long. He's towards the end of his career. But some of these journeyman types, Nate Chandler, Silatalu, they're gone. And also a very key figure in terms of what we look at a real football analysis, the interior defensive line, Dwan Edwards. When Ron Rivera first showed up, he brought Dwan Edwards in as a seasoned veteran to hold up that interior defensive line. Mike Smith did something similar when he got to Atlanta because there was too much, how should we say, with certain coaches like Bobby Petrino in that case, trying to develop that interior defensive line too soon with younger guys that may or may not work out. And Carolina went through many or several younger interior defensive line prospects, high draft choices, whatnot. I don't have the names with me right now because this is a while ago. Before Ron Rivera said, look, let's just bring in Dwan Edwards, shore up the line. We'll, with the other spot, we're going to draft. And they drafted star how do you say his name? Star Lutulele. Okay, excuse me for that. So, and he's been a key to their rebuilding process. Now they got Lutulele and K1 Short, and the old wily veteran Charles Johnson, along with the young Coney Ely on the outside. Jared Allen is gone, so they lose just a little bit there. I mean, he was just a one-year guy. But they are a stable and rebuilding program on the uprise. So we will be talking about Carolina in the next podcast as a possible Super Bowl possibility, just like we did with the Packers. We didn't really see that in the East so much. But either of those teams going against the Patriots from the AFC, for example, is a certain possibility. But that's for next time. Let's look at the rest of the South. Now, Atlanta is going through a lot of changes. They bring in Alex Mack. They lose a lot of offensive line, and their defense has been a work in progress. So, and it's a 4-3 defense, but there's plenty of flux there. So that's a team in transition. If they gel, then we'll see, And a lot of times we don't judge teams' performances here at Real Football Analysis by wins and losses, but that's the standard in many places. Sometimes those wins and losses can be kind of fluky in football. It's a wacky game. A turnover here and there can change your solid performance. The better performing team doesn't always win. It comes down to if you factor turnovers as unearned errors, let's say, and that's kind of what we do with the ERA formula. That's why we use that baseball term, is that we're trying to call those kind of unforced errors, okay, versus earned runs, which a lot of teams earn a lot of dominance in a game, but that can lead to a lower score. If you dominate in the trenches in the old school days, you're dominating the clock more than you were the scoreboard. So one turnover or one pick could turn a game very quickly. Anyway, the Saints are very similar to the Falcons. They are a work in progress, especially offensive line. They've been going through some changes. You know, that line that was so dominant in the Super Bowl victory they had against the Colts way back a few years ago. Now it's been a while. That offensive line is now kind of almost gone. Okay, they had Carl Nix, they had Jari Evans, and Jermon Bushrod of recent memory went to Chicago last year. So they've been looking for a left tackle. They think they have one in Teron Armstead. Other members of that line are pretty much gone. And for example, Jari Evans is now gone, so that's just another member. However, they did pick up Max Unger in a good trade with Seattle for the superstar tight end, and that has helped them solidify their O line. And I'm sorry, I forgot. Jimmy Graham is who I'm talking about. So Jimmy Graham for Max Unger, and that was the beginning of kind of like solidifying their O-line. Their O-line should be coming around, but their defense has been the issue. They are going to transition out of the 3-4, which is a good step, I believe. We've always kind of said a hybrid 4-3 is kind of what Belichick has had success with in the new era. And a lot of 3-4s that are just still featuring linebackers have been struggling. You put in a safety for the linebacker like they do in Arizona. That's a modern hybrid. That is a modern hybrid that's coming around. You see DBs are being featured a lot more than linebackers in this new age. In fact, the way Dom Capers does it in Green Bay is substitute a lot out of the 3-4 into nickel and dime packages. And, A.J. Hawk used to complain that he didn't even get on the field for a single play a couple of times. And, of course, now he's a Bengal. So the emphasis now is going to the back seven, as we call it here, and not the front seven. All right, moving on to Tampa Bay. This is an interesting team. They have a new first-year head coach, but he did not bring a lot of flux and instability. In fact, I think other than his scheme, which is, it's going to take time to learn, let's see how they gel, because this team is fairly stable on the O-line and developing. And meanwhile, their D-line is still at Gerald McCoy. They're running with Clinton McDonald, a previous Seahawk, for a couple of years now. So we didn't see a whole lot of flux. There are some losses like Bowers, McDaniel, Melton, guys they brought in to plug in last year under Lovie Smith to just kind of plug in and shore things up are gone. So some of that depth is gone. We're going to have to see how healthy they are. And we see that with a lot of teams with a lot of flux, that their depth has been impacted. So now we'll move on. So we move on to the NFC West for right now, and then we'll go over to the AFC to round out our conferences. All right. A lot of preseason reviews still have Seattle at the top of the West. It is a wide open division, but Seattle is now going through a lot of flux, particularly on their O-line. They've been doing a lot of rebuilding last year, and that's why they dropped off last year. And now they've lost Russell Okung. They're looking for a left tackle, hoping that Bradley Sowell from Arizona will fill in the gaps. They also lost J.R. Sweezy, going to Tampa Bay, Alvin Bailey to Cleveland. So a lot of their depth is gone as well. let's see how they do. They drafted some youngsters as well, and we'll see how they develop. But just to assume that their offense is going to be the same and be able to run down your throat like they have with Marshawn Lynch. Well, Marshawn Lynch is not going to be the only factor. As much as I'm a California Bear proponent, I believe Rawls is just as capable and the other backs they have. But how about that line? So it's going to take time for that line to gel. And they started the process last year, so that's a plus. So let's see. But right now, still rebuilding. On the defensive side, the defensive line tandem that we look at those tandems like the media looks at quarterbacks. Now, quarterbacks are an important position, but we're looking at the other opposite angle. We're trying to give an alternative view, counterculture. And so, fact of the matter is, when we look at defensive tackle tandems, it does make a difference when you break those tandems up. And last year, they let Tony McDaniels go, and it was McDaniels and Mebane that they had all those championship runs with and Super Bowl runs. So that tandem is now completely gone, other than the fact that McDaniels came back over from Tampa Bay just recently. Their new tandem is Rubin and Hill, Tyba Rubin that they got from Cleveland has kind of filled in, and eventually he gelled in there. But I do believe that early in the season they really missed Tony McDaniel, and I think they'll miss Mebane a little bit here too. So Jordan Hill is the guy filling in. So it'll take time for the Seahawks to gel. In the meantime, Arizona, a team that also has some rebuilding that they're doing on their O-line now. They lost some O-linemen, Ted Larson and Bobby Massey, both to Chicago, by the way, are trying to shore things up with Evan Mathis and keep building their young O-line. I believe that Arizona's on the upswing. And mainly because on their D-line, they're trying to emphasize pass pressure. Excellent hybrid defense that they have, and they're going to add Chandler Jones from New England to that D-line, and they did draft with some emphasis on a D tackle. So they are looking at pass rush as a solution to getting better. I think they're on the upswing. Another team that could be on the upswing is the Rams. Now, I told you that we don't look at wins and losses. The Rams were an enigma from last year. With the defensive talent they have, they should have never been that bad. But we know they struggled on the offensive side of the ball, and offense and defense are connected in that way. If your offense puts your defense on the field a lot, they're going to be worn out. They're not going to look like a top defense. They're not going to play like that. But when an offense can keep the defense fresh, it allows the defense to develop even if they're rebuilding, like in Pittsburgh and like in Dallas a couple of years ago. The offense in this day and age can hold you up, especially if they're dominant in the run game or possession. And the Patriots lived with a rebuilding offense for the last 4 or 5 years. So, I'm sorry, a rebuilding defense for the last 4 or 5 years, relying on Tom Brady's offense. So, in this day and age, an offense can prop up a defense and or bring a defense down. I believe that there's been a lot of stability. They're still staying with Jeff Fisher. I think the Rams should gel and improve. We'll see how it works. In sticking with Jeff Fisher, I think was a good move, and that brings some stability into the trenches that should pay dividends. The 49ers, well, they didn't have much flux. So that's a surprise because you bring in Chip Kelly, you would think that he would do a lot with personnel, but maybe because of being maligned on his personnel decisions back in Philadelphia, he tried to keep things stable. That should help. They lose a couple of O-linemen in Alex Boone and Jordan Devey, but I think gaining Zane Beadles in free agency, but a big boost will be Anthony Davis comes back from his 1-year retirement. So who knows what we got in San Francisco? It's kind of a mysterious. It's a question mark. Is Chip Kelly going to have success there, running the ball and keeping and running a lot of offensive plays, so putting that defense on the field a lot? They've already lost Ian Williams to injury in the offseason here, and that nose tackle has been a key issue. Glenn Dorsey has a knee issue right now. But it's been a good defense, especially when you look at the linebackers. I think they're a mystery team, the Niners. Everyone expects them to be bad, but we'll see. They could come around towards the later part of the season. The stability that Chip Kelly has kept in their trenches could end up making him look good. And he didn't go crazy with the personnel like he did in Philadelphia. All right, AFC South and West, okay? I think the West is a little bit easier, so let's talk about the South. The Colts, Chuck Pagano, they kept him. That should help them, but there was a lot of flux. A lot of loss and depth on the O-line, and on the D-line, the D-line is a little bit more stable, but they haven't been very good in the trenches. So, we have a lot of flux there. They have to protect Andrew Luck, and we'll see what they can do with all the changes. I think going with Pagano, he has a plan, and they should come around. They should gel with what they got. But they know, unlike last year when they went in free agency and got all these skill players and Andre Johnson and all that stuff, they should do better with protecting Andrew Luck, and hopefully they will get better on defense as well. Let's move on to the Houston Texans. All right. So, what do we got here? We got a loss on the D-line with Jared Crick. J.J. Watts has a back issue right now, but when he comes back, this should be a good defense. Again, this is very similar to the Rams, where maybe the offensive woes brought down what should have been an excellent defensive team. In this day and age, offensive line really counts. It affects the defensive performance, it looks like. An outstanding offensive line in Dallas and a redeveloped one in Pittsburgh helped them prop up a defense that was rebuilding and still keep winning. But a bad offense, a bad quarterback issues, whatever it was that St. Louis had, or now LA Rams, and that the Texans were maligned with in their offense last year, tend to keep them from being a defensive dominant team. However, they did make the playoffs. We know in the playoff game, the quarterback was a big issue. I think Houston should come around a bit with their outstanding defense. They need to find an answer to losing Jared Crick on that D-line, and they right now have penciled in Devin Still, but we'll see what happens at the end of training camp. The rest of that unit is so outstanding, and when you get back J.J. Watt, he should be good. Now, Gus Bradley. One of the things the Jaguars have done well from ownership on down with their GM David Caldwell is stick to the same head coach. David Caldwell there is tremendous amount of flux on a lot of departures in free agency and a lot of additions, free agency and draft. But I think David Caldwell has a plan for the Jaguars. The Jaguars look like one of those teams that brought in a lot of talent. They do have a plan. They have stability on their coach. I believe they're on the upswing, especially on their defense and their D line, where they added Malik Jackson and they added some talent. Um, and they have some stability there. They even brought in Kelvin Beachum, the left tackle from Pittsburgh, for their O line. So I see the Jaguars on the upswing. So look out for them in the AFC South. The Titans, a lot of flux. Head coach Mike Mularkey. It's a new era there. There's going to be a lot of changes. It's going to take time and to develop, but there is some stability on the O-line and the D-line nonetheless. There's not a whole lot of depth per se with a new head coach and whatnot. This is another one of those mystery type teams. We didn't have a whole lot of them. And so the Titans are kind of like what we said about the 49ers. Could be a team that really starts to develop and grow. Whether that shows up in wins or losses, we don't know. So hopefully we'll see what happens in Tennessee. Now, the AFC West, I don't think there's so mystery. A little bit here. I think there's going to be a changing of the guard. Denver, let's talk about them first. Although I don't think they'll be on the top. In order to pay Von Miller's huge contract, and he was the superstar of the Super Bowl, and he is the superstar now of the Broncos. He is the face of the Broncos. In order to make him the face of the Broncos and pay that one salary contract, they could not go with a big name move at the quarterback. And that was probably a wise move. The other thing is they've gutted a lot of their trenches. A lot of the other guys, Malik Jackson, Danny Trevathan, Evan Mathis, Ryan Harris, Ryan Clady, the list goes on. Louis Vasquez. All of these guys could not get paid at the same time that Von Miller got paid. These are the guys that don't ask for a lot of money. They're your middle of the ground. They're your blue collar, middle of the pack guys. But in order to pay your superstars, these are the guys that typically get gutted. And I don't think they added enough in free agency. Although they do add Russell Okung, Donald Stevenson from the Chiefs, Jared Crick from Houston. Very significant free agent ads. Even, Billy Wynn is a guy that could help them, on their defensive line depth. We'll see how they do. Wade Phillips, excellent defensive coach. He made them from a 4-3 to a 3-4 and still won a Super Bowl in one season. We don't see that up in Buffalo with the conversion to a 3-4. It takes time. But, of course, Denver had this personnel that went 3-4 to 4-3 and back and forth. A couple of times they were 3-4 before John Fox. And their personnel is so outstanding anyway that they're able to make that flip. So I think the Denver Broncos are in a flux. Situation of change. They're on the downswing. They're not going to be as good. And San Diego is another team that's trying to rebuild. A little bit of a mystery team. There is some stability in the trenches. They're sticking with Mike McCoy's. This is probably his last chance. But they're a team that's trying to rebuild. We'll see whether the Chargers all of a sudden start to make that progress. But like the Titans and the 49ers, we don't know much about them. Many predictions have put them last. On the other hand, the Raiders are a team that many people see on the upswing. They've had some stability. They got, the quarterback situation is more settled. Offense and defensive line has some stability. They've added some talent. Let's see. Can the Chargers stay up with the Raiders on the upswing? We'll see. But they look like a team that's on the upswing with some potential. The Chiefs, the final team we're going to talk about, look like with the most potential to probably win the West. Um, but they've had some flux. They lost Donald Stevenson, we just said. Jeff Allen goes to Houston. But they pick up, Mitchell Schwartz. Um, and they're in their second or third season with Andy Reid. So I believe they're more or less on the upswing. So let's see whether the Chiefs can fulfill the promise. A lot of people have them um, winning the West. So um, we'll look and see whether they are the team in the West or whether it could be the Raiders. And again, the Chargers being kind of that mystery team that is still growing and rebuilding. And we'll see what they can do. All right, that is a summary of more of the details in the South and West. It's been a little bit longer podcast. The next one is going to be the key. We'll talk about potential Super Bowl matchups and who is at the top and rising in the AFC and NFC. We won't focus it so much on teams that are falling. Stay tuned for that and more at realfootballanalysis.com.